Now let's go to the UK, where a 13-year-old girl was called despicable by her teacher at a Church of England school because she didn't believe people could identify as whatever they wanted. They couldn't identify as cats, for example. That was one of the arguments they were having. Have a listen to some of that interaction.
But cisgender is not necessarily the way to be. You're talking about the fact that cisgender is the norm, that you identify with the gender of the sexual organs that you're born with, or you're weird. That's basically what you're saying, which is really despicable.
How? When it's
if I called my mum right now, my mum would be on my side.
If I called my mum, she'd say.
Well, that's very sad as well then.
How is it?
Loads of people agree with that. There's only a small majority of people who actually think that.
And why do you think we have so many problems in the world with homophobia?
Yeah, but
because
that's
of people
homophobia, that's gender.
Yeah.
Yes,
I'm fine with
is.
lesbians and gay people.
Same.
I've got nothing against them.
Yeah, same.
I mean, just how vacuous that argument from the teacher is. And she brings up homophobia, and the students very rightly correct her and say, we have no problem with gay and lesbian people, and you can be gay and lesbian and not be trans in any way. I mean, this suggestion that if you are gay, then you don't identify as the gender you were born in is so utterly false, but that's what the teacher was putting forward. And the teacher even said the student should find a new school and then sent her to be punished for essentially believing in biology. Have a listen.
How you identity, how you identify. But it's not an opinion that we express in this school.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not. And if you don't like it, you need to go to a different school. So I'm reporting you to Miss Willis. You need to have a proper educational conversation about equality, diversity and inclusion.
So the teacher told the students they were being reported to school administrators and would no longer be welcome at the school if they continue to express the view that only boys and girls exist. And that's just incredible stuff. And this mess is making news around the world, Daisy, but sadly it's not isolated. Let's have a quick look at how one GB news presenter covered this story.
Meow. I learned something new today, everybody. It's perfectly acceptable to identify as a cat. You what? Don't you dare mock it, by the way, because I've decided that is now what I am, Meow Shell, to you.
Well, she's having fun with it, but I've got to say, if my 13-year-old was called despicable, told to go to a new school, was called homophobic falsely, and all sorts of other nonsense that those poor kids were copying, I'd be ropeable.
And that was one of my first thoughts, Rita, was that teacher, in my opinion, was being completely abusive to those children. In what universe is it appropriate for a teacher for any reason to scream at students, particularly in front of the rest of the classes, it seemed to be, and call them despicable or homophobic and say they were so terrible they needed to go to a new school and get a proper equity, diversity and inclusion education? That is just bullying by the teacher. And as you pointed out, the students are actually more woke than the teacher, because the teacher was confusing gender ideology with being lesbian or gay and tried to accuse them of being homophobic, but they caught it. They said, hang on a minute, no, we're not talking about that. And then later in the clip, the teacher tries to backtrack and says, but you can't see a connection between the two. So the teacher obviously has no idea what she's talking about. The kids obviously do, and good on them for pushing back and sticking up for themselves.
And the kid, when the teacher really comes at them hard, one of them says, my mum agrees with me and she'll say that. So you can see having that backbone, having that conviction, having the courage to speak. And the kids also say, most of the students think this way, but they're too scared to say anything because of what you're just doing to me now. So it comes from the home. When they know their parents are going to back them, when they know their parents are across the issue, then they have the courage to do what we just heard. But otherwise, they're just going to sit silently, swallow this nonsense and be too meek to challenge lies that are being fed to them in the classroom. Now, let's go to more lefties losing it, this time from the global warming catastrophists who want you to believe that they're not in some sad, bizarre, civilization-destroying cult. Seriously, they're all just about the science. Have a look. So much science there, Daisy, just staggering amounts of science happening there.
Oh, so much science, Rita. That is, you want to know something funny? A couple of years ago when I was walking down the streets of West End in Brisbane, I actually saw that same climate cult. There were about, half a dozen of them or more dressed in those same red outfits with painted faces and weird red veils. They weren't singing, thank goodness, but they had some weird bell thing they were playing. And one of them made direct eye contact with me, Rita, and I felt personally violated. They are very, very strange. I don't know how they can claim that they are some sort of serious movement when they do stuff like that, and also do silly stuff like the Blockade Australia protests. But yeah, they make for good television, but that's about it.
Now, remember when the ACLU wasn't just a giant joke? Now, instead of pursuing free speech and liberty, they are moaning about child killers being misgendered in prison. Florida executed child killer Dwayne Owen last week, and the ACLU took to Twitter to post this. The state of Florida never provided medically necessary gender-affirming care to Dwayne Owen, causing her enormous suffering and violating her right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment for more than 30 years she was in state custody. Thankfully, Daisy, Twitter's community notes provided some context to the ACLU's tweet with this. Dwayne stabbed 14-year-old Karen Slattery 18 times, killing her, then raped her corpse. He committed murder again years later. Kind of relevant there, yes?
Definitely relevant. I quite like that community notes feature. Thank you, Elon Musk. A very good one indeed. I mean, I'm so pleased that this tweet was absolutely slammed, because it really needs to be called out, because in addition to, doing such terrible, terrible murderous acts, psychiatrists for the state, pushed back against this gender dysphoria narrative and said they saw no evidence of gender dysphoria. They also said that Dwayne faked schizophrenia, and they also said that he displayed signs of sexual sadism. So on top of the crimes that Dwayne committed, how the ACLU can put this stuff with a straight face just shows the complete lunatic age that we live in. They should be heartily ashamed of themselves, and they should be taking that tweet down and apologizing to the moon and back to the families of the victims for such a disrespectful comment. Just appalling.
But they won't. I'm sure they'll just double down, and they'll see the reaction they've copped as just further proof that, everyone is transphobic and bigoted and hateful, and the people, decent people, sane people used to give money to the ACLU not long ago, and I know a few of them, and I'd be very interested to know if they're still giving money to that organisation with the sort of work they're up to these days. Now, Daisy, I've got some good news for the menfolk out there. They're now permitted to express an opinion on abortion. Or are they? Let's have a look at this Planned Parenthood tweet. They said, labelling abortion as only women's rights or a women's issue erases the experiences and identities of queer, non-binary and trans folks who also have abortions, and downplays the additional barriers they face when accessing care. Abortion access affects us all, period. So I don't know if that means, Daisy, men can state an opinion on abortion, but only if they identify as women, or if it's just women who identify as men or non-binary. And I'm not exactly sure what barriers to care that non-binary queer folk face when accessing abortion, but perhaps you can shed some light on all that, please.
Well, look, as for the assertion that somehow non-binary and queer folk face barriers to abortion, I'm with you. They've provided absolutely no evidence there as to what those barriers are. That all sounds very, very wishy-washy to me. Hard data, thanks, or it didn't happen. As for men being able to have an opinion on abortion, I'm sure they would say that men could if they were females who identify as men, so trans men. I mean, that's where they get this kind of logic from, and of course non-binary females. But Rita, the point to make here is that I'm sure you remember last year after the overturning of Roe v. Wade, all this messaging about how abortion isn't a women's issue disappeared overnight.
Yes.
I remember us all commenting on it at the time. Now it suddenly became women's rights and women's issues again because it was politically convenient, and they realized they were able to make a better point of it. So all of it is just, as we know, it is simply virtue signaling nonsense. They don't actually have the courage of these convictions. And the thing is, another point to note, Rita, is that men actually, biological men, so white cis hetero men, have always been able to have an opinion on abortion if they are pro-choice. You see pro-choice men waxing philosophic to the moon and back about how much they love abortion and being lauded by women who are feminists. It's only pro-life men who aren't allowed an opinion on abortion.
Now let's go to a lefty losing it that shows just how tolerant, loving and moral the left are. Here's a tattoo artist who vowed to deliberately hurt any conservative who ventured into his shop.
If you're conservative, off. Don't come to my shop. Don't do it. You know? Go to your cousin's garage or his kitchen or whoever. Go to somebody's house where you can spew your hatred.
Oh, just so much love and tolerance. I mean, the projection there is enormous, but really, I mean, having a look at the background and looking at this clown, I think I would rather get a tattoo from just some random in a garage than that dude. What a ridiculous thing to post. And the whole thing goes for several minutes, and trust me, it doesn't get any better.
No, and he starts going on about religious people as well, and how religious conservatives and religious people aren't allowed in his shop either. And I'm thinking, unless you, like, what religions are you talking about there? Because if you're talking about not just Christianity, but, you know, Judaism and Islam, the Abrahamic religions have a number of overlapping beliefs. Well, I'm sorry, shouldn't you be accused of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia? They don't sort of seem to reach these logical conclusions of their own ideology, Rita. But honestly, the bigotry runs so deep in the woke left, so deep. And what they don't realize is that included in the definition of bigotry is intolerance, sheer intolerance of other people's opinion. That is the absolute definition of violent intolerance, almost, of other people's opinions. I don't know what would possess him to put this on the internet, but it has gone viral, and I'm sure he will reap the consequences.
Well, let's hope so. You want to put that sort of demented hate into the world? You shouldn't be surprised if a little bit of it comes back to you. Now, here is some disturbing news from the medical profession. The Washington Examiner reports that students at the University of Michigan Medical School are being taught that basic anatomy is assigned by doctors at birth. Slides reviewing the foundational anatomy of the pelvic region, which were created for first-year medical students, separate male and female body parts into the categories of assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth. It is a worry, Daisy. We started talking about what's happening in New Zealand with surgeons being forced to consider race when determining who gets priority for surgery. And now we've got another example of the medical profession being captured by woke idiocy.
Yeah, and these terms actually really grind my gears, Rita, above all, because they actually don't make any sense. This whole AFAB, which is assigned female at birth, and AMAB, as they say, assigned male at birth. Being assigned something implies it can be changed later on. You can't change your sex. You can identify as whatever gender you want. We know that now, but biological sex is biological sex. If you are assigned female at birth, you are female. The term makes absolutely no sense. If they wanted to be really woke and change it to, say, ABAB, like assigned boy at birth or assigned girl at birth, that would make slightly more sense because you're actually talking about gender, which we know if you accept the premise that it's fluid, then yes, you can identify as a man or a woman or anything in between. But AFAB and AMAB, it is just so biologically ridiculous, and it's part of this insidious attempt to conflate sex and gender. They are two different things. You are male or you are female, and try as you like, you cannot change that fact.